How do you incorporate new employees in the close-knit group you and your college buddies started at Scale?
I think that one of the sort of cultural aspects that we have tried to embrace is one of transparency. So we, make every management meeting, for example, open to anyone in the company that wants to sit there. Now, most people don't want to sit through a management meeting on a weekly basis, but we will summarize those management meetings and send them out in a weekly email blast that we do to all the employees. We regularly have all hands meetings where everybody can get together. You want to have a culture where people can, voice their opinions and be heard, directly at the top, right? I think that's the key. The key to avoiding this persona that is, well, there's sort of the, elite group that knows everything that's going on and everybody else is get everybody else into that group, right? And one of the biggest advantages that a startup has is being nimble in the market. So clearly, we can change directions a lot faster than Hewlett-Packard can, and that's where our competitors are. The challenge is that if you don't have a company culture that enables you to do that as a startup, you lose that advantage, right? And if you try to be too bureaucratic as a startup and say, well, the top are going to come up with these ideas and pass them down, and people are going to work it, the feedback comes back and forth. You just don't have time, right, for that kind of thing. And so we believe in empowering individuals to make mistakes. I think that's really what it boils down to. And mistakes are a reality, and in a startup, there's something to be celebrated in reality. I mean, you learn. You learn from your mistakes, you learn from your successes, but the difference between working at a startup, at least one of my startups culturally, and I think many of the successful ones, is that making mistakes is just part of the game, and you keep moving forward, versus if you are on a sort of, call it Fortune 500 career path, people view mistakes as something that's personal, right? You made the mistake and that stays with you, and maybe that impedes your ability to advance within the organization. I hope to God none of our employees think of it that way, because it's just, you have to make mistakes in order, if you're going to try and, outmaneuver these big guys, you're just going to make mistakes along the way. And if somebody has an idea, whether it's the VP of marketing or whether it's, the entry-level marketing person that says, hey, I think if we went to this particular trade show and did this promotion, it would be great. Odds are we're going to say, all right, go for it, right? There's so little micromanagement at Scale that I think it's whatever the opposite of micromanagement would be. I don't know what that is, but the fact is, you go out there, you try something, it works, it doesn't work, and that's great, right? And I think that's really the key to our success. I think it makes it more fun for everybody. It's certainly more fun for me.
Is this style of management more popular today, or is that just your approach?
There's, for every 10 startups, there's probably at least 11 different management styles, right? So, but I think in general, as a rule of thumb, you see that more in startups. And I think even the big companies that are successful try to embrace that more. You can see, if you study the management methodology at Google, for example, they go through great lengths to try and capture at least some of that startup mentality. And I think it's just the name of the game. Now, there are plenty of other ways to run a business. Certainly, you could be sort of the dictator-like CEO and be brilliant and make all the right moves and have a great, successful business. Fortunately, I'm just not brilliant enough to pull that off, so I know better, right? I don't try to do that. I've seen successful companies that have completely opposite management styles as to what we have. So, the proof is in the results. But I think as a rule, particularly in technology startups, there tend to be heavily dependent on creativity, sort of in all members of the organization, whether it's from the product engineering staff all the way through marketing, sales, and sometimes even finance has to be a little creative, right? So I think that the creativity is best fostered in a sort of open environment, and Picasso didn't, come up with the greatest painting on the first try, right? You throw it away, you paint over it, you do whatever, and that's part of that mistake-making process that I think makes it successful.
Do you have any advice for entrepreneurs in general, or more specifically, technology entrepreneur?
Well, I would probably give the same advice whether it was a technology startup or a general startup company. But I think rule number one is to ask for help from day one. And by that I mean doing things like calling potential customers and asking them what they think of the idea, long before you've got the idea fully baked in your head. In my experience, people are extremely willing to share their thoughts. I often tell people that if they just cold call a potential customer and ask for advice, I mean, you have to get over the fear of making that cold call, but once that person picks up the phone, I guarantee you are the most interesting phone call that they've gotten all day, probably in weeks. Right? I mean, they're in their job day to day doing the same thing over and over again, and all of a sudden somebody calls up and asks them for advice. It's flattering to them to get that, and and it's extremely helpful. That's why I'm not a big believer, and I guess my the somewhat varied startup experience that I have in terms of the industries that I've been in says this, but I'm not a big believer of saying, well, you need to come from a particular industry in order to go start a company within that industry. I had no one on the management team had any storage experience prior to starting Scale. Now we've added people since then that do come from a storage background, but you can gain a tremendous amount of knowledge just by calling those folks that are in that industry and asking them questions. I think that's true both on the product side, and that's where I would always start, because you have an idea and you want to make sure that idea is good. And it probably isn't at first. It probably needs to go through some iterations of talking to folks to really hone in on what a good idea is. You're going to sit down and think about that business model with that Excel spreadsheet, and at some point you're going to come to a question that you can't answer. How much can I charge for this product? What is an acceptable margin to get? You could spend hours, days trying to research this stuff on Google, where the reality is if you just made a phone call, you would probably find out the answer in about 5 minutes. Somebody that has purchased storage products in our example before can answer that question, what a typical support contract looks like, in a 10-second phone call. Versus I'll spend weeks trying to find that, well, what does a typical support contract look like for a storage product on Google? I mean, the questions get so specific that getting sort of human knowledge to back that up makes a huge difference. So you ask other outside people about the business idea, you then build your business model by talking to those same people or new people. Same thing, talking to investors. I think, asking whether it's an angel, venture capitalist, your uncle, whoever it is, asking them, if you were to invest in a company, what would that company need to present to you before you go make that presentation? It seems obvious if I say it, right? But the reality is that most people don't do that. Most people prepare a presentation, go in there, and don't necessarily know what that specific investor might be looking for. So again, you ask for help. At the end of every one of these conversations, great question to ask is, who else could I talk to, right? If it's a customer, what other potential customers could I talk to? What other potential investors could I talk to? Be a little bit stubborn. Try not to hang up until you get at least one more name. You'll probably get a couple. And it's just a huge benefit. Don't be afraid to pick up the phone. Email just doesn't really work for that kind of thing. It's too easy to get lost in the shuffle, and it's almost impossible to really convey the emotion in an email. And by that I mean it's the excitement of the entrepreneur that's going to get these guys to want to help you. It's not just that you're the most interesting phone call they've gotten. It's that you're the most interesting phone call because the excitement on your end, and to that end, the nervousness that you're going to have making those first few phone calls is going to be obvious to the person on the other end. And, that can make all the difference in sort of making that human connection and getting the answers that you need.